Hey there, drowsy historian here. Tonight we're diving into the shadowy alleyways and gilded drawing rooms of Victorian Britain, where beneath the veneer of moral propriety and industrial progress, a different kind of revolution was brewing. Picture, if you will, the gaslit streets of 1880s London, the air thick with coal smoke and secrets, where a respectable banker might slip through a nondescript door in Limehouse, descending into a world of silk cushions and sweet-scented smoke, where society ladies sipped their afternoon tea laced with laudanum, and children's cough medicine contained more cocaine than a modern-day dealer would dare imagine. This is the story of how an entire civilization got high while preaching sobriety. How the same empire that would later wage wars against drugs was built on their profits, and how the Victorians' relationship with intoxication reveals the beautiful hypocritical complexity of human nature itself. But before we slip into those opium haze dreams, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it in your corner of the world? Drop a comment and let me know. Are you tucked into bed in Manchester watching the sunrise in Melbourne, or perhaps taking a late-night stroll through the very London streets we'll be exploring? If you're finding that ads keep interrupting these historical journeys, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. There's a link in the description for completely ad-free access to all episodes, plus early access to upcoming stories. And if you're planning to drift off during tonight's tale, I highly recommend investing in some wireless sleep earbuds. You'll find my recommendations in the description below. There's nothing quite like having history whispered directly into your dreams without the tangle of wires. Now lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. Queen Victoria has just ascended the throne, her empire stretching across continents, her subjects filled with moral certainty about their place as the civilized world's standard-bearers. Yet walk through any apothecary shop on a foggy Tuesday morning, and you'll witness something that would make a modern pharmacist faint with shock. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a pillar of her suburban community, approaches the mahogany counter with the practiced air of routine. She's here for her weekly purchase, not bread or soap but laudanum. The shopkeeper, Mr. Pembridge, greets her warmly, measuring out 2 fluid ounces of the tincture with the same casual precision he might use for peppermint oil. This amber liquid, beautiful in its glass bottle, contains enough opium to fell a horse, yet it will sit beside the sugar bowl at afternoon tea. The scent of laudanum is peculiar, bitter almonds mixed with something floral, almost perfume-like. Mrs. Hartwell uncorks the bottle briefly, inhaling its familiar aroma before tucking it into her reticule. By evening she'll have consumed enough opium to achieve what her doctor calls nervous calm, and what we might recognize as a profound state of intoxication. This was not scandalous. This was not hidden. This was Tuesday. Laudanum, powdered opium dissolved in alcohol, had become the Victorian cure-all, the liquid solution to life's myriad discomforts. Headaches, menstrual pain, crying babies, melancholy, restless legs, racing thoughts, the general malaise of existence itself. All could be soothed by this crimson medicine. Pharmacists sold it freely, doctors prescribed it liberally, and parents spooned it into teething children's mouths without a second thought. The advertisements were almost lyrical in their promises. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup proclaimed itself the mother's friend and child's relief. What they didn't advertise was that each bottle contained morphine, opium and alcohol in doses that would be considered criminal today. Children would slip into such deep drugged sleeps that some never woke up. Yet the testimonials poured in. My baby has never been so peaceful, a blessing for the entire household. Dr. James Mortimer, a fashionable physician with practice rooms in Harley Street, kept meticulous records that have survived to this day. His patient book from 1845 reads like a catalogue of Victorian womanhood's secret dependencies. Lady Catherine B., age 34, nervous exhaustion following childbirth. Prescribed laudanum twice daily. Miss Sarah W. 26 hysteria and feminine complaints. Laudanum at bedtime, with additional doses as needed. Mrs. Margaret 41 chronic melancholia. Laudanum every 4 hours increased as tolerance develops. The good doctor never used the word addiction. That concept barely existed in medical vocabulary. Instead, he wrote of increased tolerance and necessary adjustments to dosage. His lady patients grew gaunt. Their eyes developed a particular glassy brightness. Their hands shook slightly when the medicine was delayed. But these were simply signs that the treatment was taking hold of the constitution. What strikes us most profoundly about these records is their matter-of-fact tone. Dr. Mortimer was not a quack or a charlatan. He was educated at Edinburgh, respected by his peers, treating the wives and daughters of parliamentarians and industrialists. Yet by modern standards he was running what amounted to a high-class drug den, creating dependencies that would last lifetimes, all under the banner of medical respectability. The drawing rooms of Victorian England were filled with what we would now recognize as the walking wounded of the Opium Wars. Not the battles fought in China, but the quiet domestic conflicts fought against pain, boredom, and the suffocating expectations of propriety. These were wars fought with crystal decanters instead of cannons, with morning doses instead of military strategies. But respectable addiction was only part of the story. Beneath the surface of Victorian society, a vast network of pleasure seekers were discovering more exotic methods of escape. The opium den, that fixture of sensational novels and moral panic, was very much a reality, though perhaps not quite the lurid fantasy that popular imagination has painted. Follow me down a narrow staircase in Bluegate Fields, Shadwell, on a December evening, and the Thames fog has rolled in thick as wool, muffling the sounds of the docks above. Each wooden step creaks under your feet and the air grows warmer, heavy with an otherworldly sweetness that seems to coat your throat like honey. You emerge into a room that defies everything the gray streets above might have suggested. The walls are draped in deep crimson silk, their surfaces alive with the flicker of oil lamps that cast moving shadows like living creatures. The floor is scattered with Persian carpets so thick your feet sink into them as if walking on moss. Along the walls, raised platforms hold narrow beds, each equipped with a small spirit lamp, a long-stemmed pipe, and the tools of the trade: scrapers, needles, and small tins containing what looks like dark treacle but smells like paradise itself. This is Mother Abdullah's establishment, though her real name is Sarah Johnson, and she hails from Yorkshire, not the exotic East her customers imagine. She's discovered that Victorian London has an inexhaustible appetite for Oriental mystique, and she delivers it with theatrical flair. Dressed in flowing robes, her hair crowned with jeweled pins, she glides between her customers with the authority of a high priestess, administering sacred rites. The clientele tonight represents a fascinating cross-section of Victorian society. In the corner, a young gentleman in evening wear, still wearing his white gloves, lies on his side, eyes closed in blissful contemplation. He's the third son of a prominent banking family, officially reported to be traveling on the continent while actually traveling much farther than geography allows. Beside him, a middle-aged woman in a faded velvet dress holds her pipe with the practiced grip of experience. She was once a celebrated actress, before laudanum claimed her career and opium became her final performance. The ritual itself is mesmerizing to observe. Mother Abdullah approaches a customer with a small portion of opium the size and consistency of dark honey. She holds it over a lamp flame on the tip of a needle, watching it bubble and transform, releasing aromatic smoke that seems to carry away the very concept of time. When it reaches the perfect consistency, she presses it into the bowl of the long pipe. The customer takes their first draw, and you can actually watch tension leave their body like water draining from a basin. The conversation in these dens was often surprisingly intellectual. Without the social constraints that governed above-ground interactions, strangers found themselves in deep philosophical discussions about the nature of reality, the burden of consciousness, the possibility of worlds beyond this one. The opium created a democracy of escape. Titled lords found themselves debating metaphysics with dock workers. Society ladies shared profound insights with reformed criminals. But the true revelation of these spaces was not the drugs themselves, but what they revealed about the desperation for authentic experience in an increasingly mechanized, rule-bound society. These people were not seeking mere pleasure. They were seeking permission to feel without judgment, to exist without performance, to be human without the exhausting maintenance of Victorian propriety. The police occasionally raided these establishments, but with little enthusiasm. The customers were often too well connected to prosecute, and the constables themselves sometimes returned later, out of uniform, seeking their own temporary escape from the grinding respectability of their daily lives. While London's underground indulged in Eastern mystery, the mainstream Victorian world was embracing a different kind of chemical enhancement. One that came not from the poppy fields of Afghanistan, but from the coca leaves of South America, processed into a white crystalline powder that promised to solve all of life's energetic deficiencies. Cocaine arrived in Victorian Britain, not as a street drug but as a miracle medicine, endorsed by the most respected physicians, and marketed with the same enthusiasm as electric lighting or the telegraph. The year 1884 marked a turning point when Sigmund Freud published his essay Über Coca, praising cocaine as a cure for depression, fatigue, and morphine addiction. His recommendations crossed the channel faster than diplomatic cables, and suddenly every progressive doctor in London was prescribing what they called the white medicine. Dr. Arthur Conan Doyle, before he achieved fame as the creator of Sherlock Holmes, was an early enthusiast. In his medical practice in Portsmouth, he kept detailed notes on cocaine's effects, both on his patients and himself. His handwriting from this period shows the telltale signs of stimulant use, initially sharp and energetic, then increasingly erratic as doses escalated. One entry from November 1885 reads, "Remarkable clarity of thought achieved, senses heightened beyond normal parameters. Patient reports sensation of mental acuity previously unknown, dosage to be increased gradually." What Dr. Doyle and his colleagues didn't realize was that they were creating Britain's first generation of cocaine addicts, all under the banner of medical progress. The pharmaceutical companies seized upon this new market with Victorian entrepreneurial vigor. Harrods department store sold cocaine kits complete with syringe for home injection. Parker Davis and Company marketed cocaine cigarettes as treatments for asthma and throat ailment. The advertisements were works of art, elegant engravings showing well-dressed gentlemen achieving new heights of professional success after their cocaine tonics. Society ladies maintaining their beauty through the energizing effects of refined coca extract. But perhaps no product captured the zeitgeist quite like Vin Mariani, a wine-based cocaine tonic that became the drink of choice for the Victorian elite. Created by French chemist Angelo Mariani, this Bordeaux infused with coca extract promised to restore health, strength, energy, and vitality. Pope Leo XIII gave it his official endorsement, and testimonials poured in from celebrities across Europe and America. The taste was reportedly extraordinary. The wine's tannins balanced perfectly with coca's slight numbing sweetness, creating a sensation that began on the tongue and radiated throughout the body like liquid confidence. Queen Victoria herself was rumored to take a small glass with her afternoon meal, though Buckingham Palace never officially confirmed this practice. What's fascinating about Vin Mariani's marketing materials is how they captured Victorian anxieties about modern life. The advertisements spoke directly to people overwhelmed by industrialization, promising that this ancient South American medicine could help them cope with railway timetables, factory schedules, and the relentless pace of progress. They were selling more than intoxication. They were selling adaptation to modernity itself. The social rituals around cocaine consumption were markedly different from those surrounding opium. Where opium dens encouraged horizontal repose and dreamy contemplation, cocaine created vertical energy and animated conversation. The wealthy would gather for tonic parties, where the evening's entertainment centered around achieving perfect dosage, enough to feel elevated and articulate, but not so much as to create the jitters that ruined elegant conversation. These gatherings often lasted until dawn. Participants engaged in increasingly elaborate discussions about art, politics, and philosophy. The drugs seemed to unlock verbal fluency and intellectual confidence, leading to some of the most spirited debates in drawing room history. Unfortunately, it also led to some of the most grandiose and ultimately empty promises, as cocaine has always had the peculiar effect of making terrible ideas seem brilliant. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of Victorian drug culture, from our modern perspective, was how casually these substances were administered to children. The nurseries of respectable homes were virtual pharmacies, stocked with preparations that would horrify contemporary parents, but were considered essential for proper child rearing. Mrs. Charlotte Pemberton's diary from 1875 provides an intimate glimpse into middle-class Victorian childcare. She writes with the detailed attention of a loving mother tracking her infant son's development. Baby Frederick, quite restless again last night, administered 2 spoonfuls of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup at 8 o'clock. Blessed peace descended upon the household within minutes. Frederick slept so soundly that I was able to complete my correspondence and finish reading Mr. Dickens' latest installment. What Mrs. Pemberton didn't record because she didn't know was that each spoonful contained enough morphine to sedate an adult. Baby Frederick's blessed peace was actually a drugged stupor so profound that his breathing slowed to barely detectable levels. That he survived these nightly doses speaks more to the resilience of human physiology than to the wisdom of Victorian medicine. The schools were no better. Headmasters routinely dosed unruly students with laudanum to maintain classroom order. One surviving letter from Eton College dated 1869 mentions the purchase of 6 bottles of medicinal tincture for the management of excitable temperaments among the younger boys. The same institution that was supposedly preparing Britain's future leaders was systematically drugging children into compliance. But children weren't merely passive victims of adult pharmaceutical enthusiasm. They were often active participants. In working-class neighborhoods, children as young as 8 or 9 were employed in opium preparation, their small fingers ideal for the delicate work of cleaning and processing raw opium into smokable form. They worked in cramped, poorly ventilated rooms, constantly exposed to opium dust and fumes, developing dependencies before they could properly pronounce the word. The gin palaces of London, those glittering temples to cheap alcohol, often served as informal childcare centers where working mothers would leave their children with a penny and instructions to keep them quiet. The proprietors developed specialties in child-appropriate intoxicants, watered-down gin mixed with sugar, laudanum drops on bits of bread, even tiny clay pipes filled with opium for the older children. These scenes, documented in contemporary social reform reports, paint a picture of childhood that seems almost medieval in its casual acceptance of chemical alteration. Yet from the Victorian perspective, they were simply practical solutions to the problems of poverty and social order. If laudanum kept babies quiet so mothers could work, if opium made hungry children forget their empty stomachs, if cocaine helped young factory workers maintain the pace demanded by industrial machinery, then surely these substances were evidence of divine providence providing chemical solutions to social problems. The Victorian era was not just about using drugs, it was about discovering them, creating them, and marketing them with an enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. The period from 1850 to 1900 saw more new psychoactive substances introduced to the British market than any comparable period in history. German chemists were leading this pharmaceutical revolution, their laboratories becoming the epicenters of mind-altering innovation. In 1897, Felix Hoffmann at Bayer synthesized both aspirin and heroin in the same month, a dual achievement that perfectly captured the Victorian balance between healing and intoxication. Heroin was originally marketed as a non-addictive substitute for morphine, a cough suppressant so safe that it could be given to children. The irony was lost on everyone at the time. The marketing departments of these pharmaceutical companies were marvels of creative enthusiasm. They produced beautifully illustrated catalogs that read like adventures in chemistry, promising to solve every human ailment through proper molecular intervention. Bayer's promotional materials for heroin featured testimonials from respected physicians, praising its remarkable freedom from harmful effects and its ability to restore normal respiratory function without the complications associated with traditional opium preparation. These catalogs were distributed not just to doctors but directly to the public. Victorian consumers could leaf through page after page of chemical solutions to life's problems, ordering everything from headache powders containing caffeine and cocaine to feminine regulators based on ergot alkaloids that could terminate pregnancies as easily as they treated menstrual cramps. The home chemistry set became a popular Christmas gift for curious Victorian children, complete with samples of various pharmaceutical preparations for educational experiments. These sets typically included small quantities of chloral hydrate for understanding sleep medications, cannabis tincture for studying plant-based medicines, and cocaine solutions for examining local anesthetics. That children might consume these samples rather than merely studying them was considered a natural part of the learning process. But the real pharmaceutical frontier was in the realm of patent medicines, those mysterious concoctions sold by traveling salesmen and advertised in newspapers with wild claims and even wilder ingredients lists. Dr. Hammond's nerve and brain pills promised to cure everything from neuralgia to mental exhaustion from overstudy. Analysis would later reveal they contained cocaine, caffeine, alcohol, and trace amounts of strychnine, a combination that certainly provided immediate effects, though probably not the therapeutic ones advertised. The beauty of patent medicines was their complete freedom from regulation or standardization. Entrepreneurs could combine any substances they wished, make any claims they dared, and market their creations to an eager public hungry for chemical solutions to modern problems. The results were often spectacular, occasionally effective, and sometimes fatal, but always profitable. Understanding Victorian drug culture requires recognizing how intimately it was connected to Britain's imperial project. Every substance flowing through London's veins had been extracted from some corner of the empire, often at enormous human cost that was carefully hidden from domestic consumer. The opium came from Bengal, where British administrators had forced local farmers to abandon food crops in favor of poppies, creating both a drug supply for China and recurring famines for India. The cocaine originated in Peru and Bolivia, where indigenous coca farmers found themselves supplying an industrial demand they barely comprehended. Cannabis preparations derived from British-controlled territories in the Caribbean and South Asia, where traditional medical knowledge was being systematically extracted and commercialized. This global drug trade required infrastructure rivaling that of more legitimate commodity. British shipping companies developed specialized vessels with climate-controlled holds for preserving opium during the long journey from Calcutta to London. Railroad companies created discrete cargo categories for pharmaceutical shipments, using coded manifests that disguised the true nature of their content. Banking houses developed financial instruments specifically for the drug trade, allowing profits to be laundered through multiple currencies and territories before reaching British investors. The East India Company's involvement in the opium trade is well documented, but less known is how thoroughly drug commerce penetrated Victorian society's highest levels. Respectable London banks financed opium production, insurance companies covered drug shipments, and politicians invested their personal fortunes in pharmaceutical companies while publicly advocating for moral reform. Lord Pemberton Smith, a prominent member of Parliament who regularly spoke against Chinese vice and the moral degradation of opium smoking, privately held substantial shares in 3 companies involved in opium processing and distribution. His public condemnation of drug use was delivered while personally profiting from every pipe smoked in London's Chinatown, a hypocrisy so common it barely merited comment. The imperial connection also shaped how different substances were perceived culturally. Opium, associated with the East, carried connotations of mysterious wisdom and ancient knowledge, but also of racial otherness and potential contamination. Cocaine linked to South America was seen as primitive energy requiring civilized refinement. Cannabis connected to Africa and India was viewed as simultaneously therapeutic and savage. These racialized perceptions influenced consumption patterns throughout Victorian society. Well-bred ladies would consume laudanum without shame, but avoid opium dens because of their association with Chinese immigrants. Gentlemen would inject cocaine while condemning the primitive intoxication of working-class opium smokers. The substances themselves were less important than the cultural narrative surrounding their use. Victorian intoxication was never just about the drugs themselves. It was about the elaborate rituals, specialized equipment and aesthetic experiences that transformed mere consumption into high art. The Victorians, with their love of ceremony and attention to detail, elevated drug use into a series of refined practices that would make modern users seem positively primitive. Consider the cocaine injection ritual practiced in fashionable London clubs during the 80s. This was not the hurried, secretive affair of modern addiction, but a leisurely ceremony performed with equipment that would not have been out of place in a jeweler's workshop. The syringes were crafted from silver and ivory, engraved with the user's initials and stored in velvet-lined cases like precious instruments. The cocaine itself was dissolved in solutions prepared by high-end chemists, often flavored with essential oils and presented in crystal vials that caught the gaslight like liquid diamonds. The injection process was conducted with surgical precision and social ritual. Users would gather in private rooms, often wearing silk robes or smoking jackets, creating an atmosphere of medical respectability combined with decadent luxury. The actual injection was preceded by careful cleaning of the injection site with rose water, precise measurement, dosage using graduated glass instruments, and often a toast to health and enlightenment before the needle found its mark. The paraphernalia associated with opium smoking reached even greater heights of artistic achievement. The pipes were works of art, carved from exotic woods, inlaid with mother-of-pearl, fitted with bowls of jade or porcelain, painted with landscapes that seemed to move in the lamplight. The lamps themselves were masterpieces of metalwork, designed to provide the precise heat needed for optimal opium preparation while creating atmospheric lighting that enhanced the entire experience. But perhaps the most sophisticated drug culture developed around cannabis consumption, which the Victorians approached with characteristic scientific enthusiasm. The Cannabis Club, meeting monthly in discreet locations throughout London, gathered physicians, writers and artists to explore what they called consciousness expansion through botanical intervention. The club's procedures were documented in meticulous detail by Dr. Reginald Morrison, who served as secretary from 1875 to 1889. Each session began with precise measurement of cannabis tincture, usually dissolved in wine or honey to mask the bitter taste. Participants would consume their doses while reclining on specially designed furniture, chairs that could be adjusted for optimal comfort as the effects developed. The conversations that emerged from these sessions were recorded in the club's official minutes, and they make fascinating reading. Victorian intellectuals, freed from the constraints of normal consciousness, engaged in discussions that prefigured many later philosophical and artistic movements. They debated the nature of time, explored synesthetic experiences where colors had flavors and sounds had textures, and developed theories about consciousness that wouldn't gain academic acceptance for another century. What strikes modern readers is how seriously they took these experiences. This wasn't recreational drug use as we understand it, but systematic exploration of consciousness conducted with scientific rigor and artistic sensibility. They were genuinely convinced they were pioneering new forms of human experience, expanding the boundaries of Victorian civilization into previously unexplored territories of the mind. Nothing illustrates the beautiful absurdity of Victorian drug culture quite like the simultaneous existence of the temperance movement and the cocaine industry. The same society that was organizing massive rallies against the evils of alcohol was enthusiastically embracing substances that made gin look like weak tea. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1874, became one of the most powerful political forces in late Victorian Britain. Their literature painted alcohol as the destroyer of families, the corrupter of youth, the root cause of poverty and crime. Their meetings drew thousands of women who pledged to banish demon rum from British society forever. Yet many of these same crusaders were daily consumers of patent medicines containing alcohol concentrations that would have impressed a sailor. Mrs. Letitia Thornberry, a prominent temperance lecturer who traveled throughout England speaking against the evils of drink, regularly consumed Tierce's golden medical discovery, which was 23% alcohol stronger than most wine. When questioned about this apparent contradiction, she responded that medicinal alcohol serves an entirely different purpose from recreational alcohol being refined by scientific knowledge and administered with moral intention. This kind of reasoning was typical of Victorian approaches to intoxication. Context, intention, and social respectability could transform identical chemical experiences from vice to virtue, from moral failing to medical necessity. The same opium that created depraved Oriental addiction when smoked in dens became therapeutic medication when consumed as laudanum in drawing rooms. The medical establishment played a crucial role in maintaining these distinctions. Physicians developed elaborate theories about therapeutic intoxication versus recreational degradation, arguing that drugs produced entirely different effects depending on the circumstances of their consumption. A gentleman taking cocaine for nervous exhaustion was engaging in progressive medical treatment. A working-class woman using the same substance for energy was displaying moral weakness. These contradictions reached their peak in the treatment of women's mental health. Victorian medicine identified dozens of specifically feminine disorders: hysteria, neuralgia, nervous exhaustion, moral insanity, all requiring chemical intervention. The same society that restricted women's access to education, property, and political participation, then medicated them into compliance when they displayed frustration with their circumstances. Dr. Arabella Mansfield's case study from 1880. She describes treating a young woman who displayed inappropriate intellectual ambition and resistance to domestic duty. The prescription: twice daily doses of laudanum combined with complete mental rest and isolation from stimulating influences like books or newspapers. When the patient's symptoms persisted, the dosage was increased until she achieved proper feminine tranquility. What Dr. Mansfield was describing in modern terms was the systematic drugging of a woman whose only crime was wanting an education. But in Victorian medical discourse, this became evidence of pharmaceutical science's power to restore natural social harmony disrupted by unfortunate psychological aberrations. By the 1890s, cracks were beginning to show in the Victorian faith in chemical solution. The first generation of laudanum users were aging, and their long-term effects were becoming impossible to ignore. Respected ladies were showing up at social gatherings in states of obvious intoxication. Children raised on patent medicines were displaying learning difficulties and behavioral problems. The promise of pharmaceutical perfection was running up against the reality of human physiology. William Osler, one of the most respected physicians of his generation, began documenting what he called medicinal disease, illness caused not by natural processes, but by the very treatments designed to prevent illness. His case studies from Johns Hopkins Hospital describe patients whose original complaints had been minor but whose years of pharmaceutical treatment had created dependencies far more serious than their initial problems. One particularly tragic case involved Lady Margaret Ashworth, who had originally sought treatment for mild insomnia following her husband's death. After 5 years of increasing laudanum doses, she required hourly medication to maintain basic functioning. Her day revolved entirely around drug administration schedules.
her social interactions limited to other users who understood the demands of pharmaceutical dependence. She had become, in Dr. Osler's words, a prisoner of the very medicine that promised her freedom. The pharmaceutical companies initially responded to these concerns with what we would now recognize as classic addiction industry tactics. They developed improved formulations that promised all the benefits of their original products with none of the side effects. They funded studies that attributed adverse effects to user error or pre-existing constitutional weakness. They created entirely new categories of medications designed to treat the problems caused by their earlier medication. But public awareness was slowly shifting, aided by a new generation of medical researchers who were beginning to understand the mechanisms of tolerance and dependence. The concept of addiction as a medical rather than moral phenomenon was gradually gaining acceptance, though it would be decades before this understanding translated into significant changes in medical practice. Social reformers also began connecting drug dependency to broader social problems. Settlement house workers in London's East End documented how patent medicine dependency trapped families in cycles of poverty, as increasing portions of household income went to maintaining pharmaceutical habits. Religious leaders began questioning whether substances that created such obvious suffering could truly be instruments of divine healing.
The international opium conferences of the early 1900s marked the beginning of the end for unrestricted drug commerce. Though they initially focused on trade and diplomatic concerns, rather than public health, Britain's participation in these conferences required confronting the contradiction between condemning Chinese opium use while profiting from global drug trafficking. As Queen Victoria's long reign drew to a close, so too did Britain's age of chemical innocence. The new century would bring new understandings of addiction, new approaches to medicine, and new anxieties about the role of drugs in society. But it would also inherit the Victorian legacy of expecting chemical solutions to social problems, a legacy that would shape drug policy and medical practice for generations to come. The last great Victorian drug controversy erupted around heroin, which Bayer had been marketing as a safe alternative to morphine since 1898. By 1905, reports were emerging of users who had become more dependent on heroin than they had ever been on morphine. The safe substitute was proving more addictive than the substance it was supposed to replace, a pattern that would repeat throughout the 20th century. Yet even as evidence mounted of heroin's dangers, Victorian medical authorities struggled to abandon their faith in pharmaceutical progress. Surely, they reasoned, the problem was not with chemical intervention itself, but simply with finding the right chemical for the right purpose. Research continued into non-addictive opioids, therapeutic stimulants, and controlled hallucinogens, always chasing the Victorian dream of perfect drugs that could enhance human experience without human cost. The social structures that had supported Victorian drug culture were also evolving. The informal networks of sharing and mutual support that had characterized opium dens and cocaine salons were being replaced by more commercial and medicalized relationships. Users became patients, suppliers became doctors, and drugs became prescriptions, a transition that promised greater safety but also greater isolation for those struggling with dependency. Women's changing roles in society also affected drug culture patterns. As the New Woman movement challenged Victorian gender expectations, the specifically feminine drug dependencies that had characterized the era began to shift. Female intellectuals and activists were less willing to accept chemical pacification as medical treatment, leading to new tensions between patients and physicians. The artistic and literary communities that had embraced consciousness-altering substances were beginning to grapple with the creative costs of chronic intoxication. Writers and poets who had initially found inspiration in opium or cocaine were discovering that long-term use dulled rather than enhanced their abilities. The romantic notion of the drug-inspired genius was giving way to more sober assessments of chemical influence on creativity. As we reach the end of our journey through Victorian drug culture, it's worth reflecting on how profoundly this period shaped modern attitudes toward intoxication, medicine, and social control. The Victorian era established patterns of thinking about drugs that persist today. The distinction between medical and recreational use, the belief in pharmaceutical solutions to social problems, the racialization of different substances and their users, the global networks that supplied Victorian drug appetites, evolved into modern pharmaceutical and illegal drug trades, often following the same geographic routes and power relationships established in the 19th century. The companies that marketed cocaine and heroin to Victorian consumers became the foundations of today's pharmaceutical industry, carrying forward the same confidence in chemical intervention that characterized their 19th century predecessor. Perhaps most significantly, the Victorian experience demonstrated how societies can normalize extraordinary levels of intoxication while maintaining the fiction of sobriety and moral rectitude. The mechanisms that allowed respectable Victorians to consume dangerous quantities of drugs while condemning others for similar behavior continue to operate in modern drug policy, creating similar contradictions and hypocrisy. The medical profession's role in both creating and treating drug problems also has Victorian roots. The same doctors who created the first generation of pharmaceutical addicts also developed the first theories of addiction treatment, establishing the pattern of medical authority over consciousness-altering substances that continues today. Yet there was something uniquely hopeful about Victorian approaches to intoxication, a belief that human consciousness could be improved through chemical means, that suffering was not inevitable, and that science could create solutions to the fundamental problems of human existence. This optimism, even when misguided, represented a faith in human possibility that modern drug culture has largely abandoned. The Victorians got high with the same enthusiasm they brought to building railways and conquering continents, seeing no contradiction between moral purpose and chemical assistance, between social respectability and pharmaceutical dependence. Their failure was not in seeking chemical solutions to human problems, but in believing that such solutions could come without human costs. As we've seen tonight, the story of Victorian drug culture is ultimately a story about the beautiful, terrible complexity of human nature, our endless capacity for self-deception, our desperate need for escape from consciousness, and our persistent hope that somewhere, in some combination of molecules and circumstances, lies the key to perfect existence. The fog has lifted from those gaslit streets, the opium dens have crumbled and the patent medicine bottles lie empty in museums. But the dreams and disappointments they represented, the eternal human search for chemical transcendence, continue to shape our world in ways both subtle and profound. And there we are, lost in the smoke and mirrors of Victorian chemical culture, where respectability and intoxication dance together in the gaslight, where the same society that built an empire also built the world's first pharmaceutical dependencies, and where the line between medicine and madness was as thin as opium smoke itself. I hope tonight's journey through these foggy streets and velvet-draped rooms has given you some new perspectives on how societies construct their relationships with intoxication, and how the past continues to shape our present in ways we might never have imagined. What other historical mysteries would you like to explore together? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. I love hearing what captures your curiosity. And if you've enjoyed having history whispered directly into your dreams, consider supporting these late-night historical expeditions on Patreon. You'll get early access to upcoming episodes, completely ad-free listening, and the satisfaction of keeping these stories alive for future drowsy historians. Special thanks to supporters like Margaret, David, and Sarah, whose contributions make these journeys possible, and to all of you who've shared these stories with friends or left thoughtful comments about your own historical interest. Until next time, sweet dreams, and remember, the past is never quite as distant as we imagine. Sleep well.